Oh, well, hello, everybody.
Hey there, Francois.
Everybody's doing well. Christopher. Hey, Gail. How are you? Good to see you.
Hi, everybody. There we go.
Yeah, it's tricky, that mute. All right. Well, I'm kind of excited to talk about dimensions, actually. Over here.
Said no one ever.
Said me just now.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. The fourth dimension could be an interesting conversation.
I am. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and that's right at 12:01. See if this mouse works. All right, it does. Great. So I'm just going to wait another minute or two just in case there are any stragglers, but I don't know. This is one of those unsung topics that I think we all take for granted. So hopefully this will be helpful and informative. And it was an opportunity for me to learn something new and different. So, anyone have any dimensioning war stories? I've got a couple. Okay, I'm gonna, well, I don't see people streaming in, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I've got this project that we're working on currently, kind of easing out of schematic design. And let's dimension it. So one of the questions that I often hear is, where should I dimension? So got a couple of options. One is to go ahead and dimension directly in your design layer. Let me, I think I want to say that I may have a mouse tracker applet. I don't remember what it is though, because I don't think mouse pose is working. All right, well, we'll just have to do without that. So right now I'm over here. I don't know if you can tell. I'm over here in the design layer that populates the viewport where we just were. There's the viewport, it's on a sheet layer, and it's just a regular vanilla plan viewport. And I'm using double clicking on the viewport to navigate over to the design layer. And so it's tempting if I just grab my dimension tool to go ahead and start dimensioning right here on the design layer, which, I suppose that's okay. The tool, of course, has multiple modes, right? Like any tool, there's a constrained, linear, and chain dimension mode. That's probably what I use the most of. There's also a baseline and an ordinate mode, and I almost never, I can't remember the last time I used any of those. So, the operation's fairly straightforward. Oftentimes it's helpful to use the zoom loop. So that's the Z key, kind of gets you in here. So click from one point to the other. I can use the zoom loop again to snap, and then pull the dimension string away. And look, hey presto, there you have it. It's a dimension string. I think we all get the concept. A few things about the dimension string. One is that you can control the length directly from the object info palette. Right? So I could go ahead and make that say 3'3". Of course, now it's no longer snapping to any real geometry, so do that at your peril. Smooth that back to where it was. The other thing that I can do with the dimension is I can double click on the dimension itself, and then it turns blue. The dimension value is itself obviously editable. It becomes this highlighted text block. And then I have these three little buttons, one at the midpoint between the two points that we're dimensioning to, and then the points themselves. So I can click on any of those. So that's kind of like the reshape function in the dimension palette. And so I could just click on this point and then change that to 38. And when I hit return, then the dimension resizes to 3'2". And whatever point that I clicked on, that point stays fixed, and the rest of the dimension resizes accordingly. Now, if I have some, let's do this. I've got some dimension, some decimal kind of fraction here. If I don't want to show 3 1/8, for example, I might go ahead and change the precision on the dimension string to either be no fractions or say 1/2 inch, so it will round off accordingly. I find that's particularly useful for things like site plans, where maybe you're dimensioning, triangulating your dimensions from an existing feature to a new proposed feature. And, I guess you could dimension that to 1/8 of an inch, but I mean, who are we kidding? That's probably not how it's going to get laid out on site. Then, of course, if my dimension is too tight, right, or even tighter than that, I'm say dimensioning the wall thickness, right? I can click on the text itself and drag it off horizontally, right? As close or really as far as I want. And I can also move the text up and, move the text up and away. So all of that is pretty fungible, kind of nice for dimensioning in tight spaces. And I can control all of that numerically from the object info palette. So I can do the text offset of say 2 inches or 20 inches or whatever. And if I start pulling it around and I'm not happy with that, I can always click on auto position text, and then it recenters itself, and then the text offset, I'll have to fix that manually. With the dimension itself, I can add leaders, right? It doesn't add a space, so I need to add a space at the end so that appears right there. Wall thickness 3.5 inches. And then in parentheses, I could put for a trailer, 2x4 stud wall. Not that I would ever do this, but just to illustrate the point. And then the note is a relatively new feature in the last few revisions, probably 3 or 4 revisions ago, where in addition to having leading text and text afterwards, I can put text below that dimension. So, verify with the structural engineer, or, whatever. I can box my text. Note that won't box the note below. I can flip it, do all sorts of things just by playing around here with the dimension string. So all of that is, I think, pretty straightforward. Sometimes, you know, I use dimension strings and I just turn off the dimension value and I sort of use the dimension string, the dimension tool as a notation tool in a sense. So it's, you know, kind of a note with witness lines. So the tool is not limited, strictly speaking, to purely to dimensions. So in this other mode, this chain mode, right, slightly different. And here I would just, again, love to use the zoom loop to start. I would just click on one point, drag to another, maybe use the zoom loop if I don't trust my snaps entirely. And then I drag off just as before, right? And then as now it's going to give me as many of these strings as I want. So I can just click to that point, and I could then click to this point, and then even come across here to that corner of the building. And just by double clicking or clicking twice in the same place, now I'm getting, I'm terminating that chain dimension. So again, the operation is I zoom in if I want. I click to establish the length, just like a single dimension string. Every time I click, I get another string. And then to end the operation, I just want to click twice in the same place. Sometimes if you get a little too excited with your double click, you'll move the mouse just a little bit and then you'll get some tiny, tiny little fraction. Let's do that again, and I'm going to deliberately mess up. Whoops, not in that way though. That's not how I meant to mess up in a different way. All right, so now I've got my dimension string and my chain dimension, and I realize that I've missed dimensioning this little element here. So I could, a couple of options. One is I could just ungroup this dimension string or chain dimension, and then it just turns it into 3 individual dimension strings. I could also go to modify and compose, and then it will recompose those individuals into a single chain. Now you could also, I could have drawn those 3 individually and composed them as a chain. But if I do that, I have to make sure that I'm snapping to the same point. So now I can compose those. Let me undo that. But if this one's off, I don't think I can compose these. Nope, didn't work, right? Likewise, if even if this one is snapping, it's the same distance, but the snap point is on the same line, but it's not at the exact same point. See, it composed 2 of them, but it didn't compose that one. To get all 3 of them composed, they have, each of the adjacent strings has to hit the exact same point over here. All right, cool. So now I've got a single chain dimension. That's super convenient because then I can just drag one and they all come together, but I forgot a piece. So what I can do is I can just go to either this leader line or witness line or this witness line. I can just hover over it, and then I'm going to right click on my mouse, and I get this constraint, this contextual menu, excuse me. And notice that here towards the bottom, I have add dimensions. And so now it's going to give me this free floating dimension, and I can just add a dimension. So you see it's broken, it's now broken this up into 2 more dimensions. I can do that again. And there we go. So very cool. Now, some of this is new construction and some of this is existing. Here's the existing wall and here's the darker new wall, right? So what if I want to allude to that in my note? Well, great, I could just go to this dimension and I could call this new addition. So I'm just going to add a little note here. I'm actually going to spell it right. New, yeah. Uh-oh, now it's added that note to all of these dimension strings. All right, so instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click again. And now I have this edit dimension command in the contextual menu. And so now I get the object properties, but only for that one length of the entire dimension chain that I selected. And so now it only applies that note to this one, not to any of the others. Same thing goes for the trailers, right? Or I could click here and just add a trailer of verifying field to all of them. And then I could just right click on this one, edit dimension, and remove it from just that one. So these existing condition dimensions are VIF. Can you guys see that? Just, yeah.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Francois, so the dimensions in this example are opposite of where they would typically be. Is it rotated in on the design layer?
Yes, yeah, this is a rotated plan.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. It just so happens that's how I laid out the drawings. There we go. Okay, so important to know that you can edit it. Now, don't get confused with your context menu. There's also an edit command here, but if you use the edit command, that's just like double clicking that individual dimension string. That's not the same thing as not edit up here, edit dimension right there. You know, and I can split and delete the dimensions. You get the idea. So that's a constrained dimension. It's horizontal, vertical, either single dimensions or dimension chains. So there's also an unconstrained dimension, right? So if I go to my dimensions and notes palette, there it is. Here's my constrained linear dimension. I order mine alphabetically because I can still remember my alphabet much more reliably than I can remember where tools go on any given palette. So unconstrained linear dimension is way down here under U. And you'll notice that that has fewer options, right? But it has all the basic options. So an obvious use for that is if I have some sort of rotated geometry, right? If I just dimension it, that might be entertaining, but not very useful. So I could do an unconstrained linear dimension. I've got a keyboard shortcut for that, right? And so now I could just dimension it over here and dimension it over there. But sometimes it can be tricky. If I have some more articulated geometry. Let me beef up the line weight here. All right, so if I have a little bit more articulated geometry and I want to do an unconstrained dimension, that's a bit of a problem, right? So, of course, if you're using an unconstrained dimension with a chain dimension, a little bit less of an issue. So sometimes instead of using the unconstrained dimension for rotated geometry, what I'll do is I'll actually just rotate the plan and then use the constrained dimension. So I'll just click on this rotate plan tool here and just drag a line, and it will then make that orthogonal to the screen. And now I'll just ditch this tool and switch over to my regular old constrained dimension because it's just drawing orthogonally. Okay, and then I can just go back to my previous state. So that's just a little trick. Sometimes it's that's helpful. If you're not getting quite the results that you want from the unconstrained dimension tool, try doing a rotated plan and then dimension that with the constrained tool.
Francois, question.
Yeah.
Would you show again how you did that quick rotation and then you use the arrow to get back again?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So over here in the up here in my mode bar, I've got this little current plan rotation. Under my widgets here, let's see, rotated view is checked. Can you see that, Gail?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's what gives me that. So I can just click on that, and then I just click a line. It's useful to snap to geometry, and then it will treat that as the x-axis of my rotated view. You see, I've got this rotated X and Y down here that tells me that I'm rotated. And then I can just use my, rather than unrotating, because I'm actually rotating a plan that's already rotated, so I don't want to unrotate completely. If I hit Command 5, that'll just unrotate the whole kit and caboodle, right? But the other thing I can do is just use the back button to get me back to the unrotated view. So rotate, and then the back button.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So there are some other dimension tools. Where am I? Unconstrained. I can have an angular dimension, right? Or yeah, an angular dimension, and arc length dimension. Let's see, what's another one that I want to talk about? Oh, radial dimension. Use that one a lot. So there's the radial dimension over here, right? So if I wanted to hover over this porch, for example, I have different modes. If I want to go with this one, I just hover over that and wait for it to line up. It's being difficult. Come on, don't be shy. I'm moving to it. There we go. No, it doesn't like that. Well, must be user error. There we go. So probably don't want to dimension inside a floor. So sometimes this, the radial dimension tool could be a little challenging to dimension something that's buried inside another object. So this is a floor, for example, for this front stoop. Or perhaps you're in an annotations and you're dimensioning something that's on a design layer, and it can be a little persnickety. So a couple of options. One is, I hate to say, is to just trace that arc with another arc and then dimension that. If you can't tell, I'm a little sheepish about that workaround, right? So there it is there, and way the heck over here. I'm just not entirely happy with how this is dimensioning. So more often than not, what I will do for these radial dimensions, to be perfectly honest, is I will just use an unconstrained dimension, and I will just find the center of the geometry, which, you know, you get these little pre-selection highlights. So you can kind of eyeball where the center of that arc is and your mouse over it, and you'll probably find it. And then just do an unconstrained dimension at an angle and just click right here. And it's rotated as Don just mentioned, because I'm on a rotated plan, right? And then I'll just add an R equals leader, for example. And just to keep everyone happy, I'll just flip the text. And then if I don't like that particular angle, I can just use my rotate tool and just rotate the dimension. Might need to flip it again. There we go. So the unconstrained dimension can serve reasonably well for radii and dimensions as well, if you can find the geometry that's the center of your curve. Would you believe that, I mean, we're already half an hour into this, and I've only hit the first thing on my list. So, oh ye of little faith. Dimensions are cool. All right, so hey, you might be wondering, why does my dimension string look like this? And you'll see that I've got a dimension standard. So let's look at our document preferences. Sorry, not Vectorworks preferences. Our document preferences, which we can get to from over here, or we can go to File, Document Settings, Document Preferences, a couple of different ways. And so one of your panes in your document preferences is the dimension pane. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that. I'm going to get back to associate dimensions in a moment. But first, I want to talk about dimension standards. So out of the box, Vectorworks comes with, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 dimension standards. And here's a custom one. So we'll just click on that. This is a slightly older feature, so there's a few extra clicks. Hasn't quite been streamlined. So I click on custom, and there will be a custom dimension here for that are all the custom dimensions that are in my current file will be there. If I have a custom dimension that I want to import, I can just click on this import button and import it from another file. So dimension standards are not resources that live in the resource manager. They long predate the resource manager. So anyway, and then once I have it, I can edit it, and you get this dialog box. And I'm not going to go through every little setting, but basically I've just tweaked the dimensions standards, the amount of gap in page length from the text to the line, for example, or the typical spacing. Now, all of these units are in page units, not scale units. So the offset is going to be 0.0125 inches if you were to put a ruler down on your drawing, regardless of the scale, right? Page inches down here. And so I like little dots instead of slash marks for my linear markers, and so on and so forth. And text position can be above left, and there's all these different things that you can play with. And once you get it just the way you love it, then you can go ahead and save it and put it in your template. And there's no way to export it. You just have to import it from another file. So go ahead and put it in your template. And then when you start dimensioning, you'll notice that there's a pull down menu, right? And there's the dimension standard. And so I can just pick a dimension standard that I want, right? And that becomes the default for any new dimensions that I draw. So that's basically how dimension standards work. Now, another preference that we just saw or setting is to create dimensions in the dimension class. So if you don't have that selected, then you won't get a standard dimension class for all of your dimensions. No right and wrong, just however you want to do it. And then speaking of classes, let's look at that. If we look at our dimension class, there it is. So like all classes, you can associate a text style with your dimension class, right? So I'm just going to cancel out of this for a second and go to my resource manager and pull up text styles. And well, I've got two of the same thing here, so I'll just delete that. Okay. And I'll delete this. Sorry, doing a little housekeeping here. Okay, that was a big waste of your time. So let me just duplicate this, and we'll just call it dimension 7-point BI for bold italic. And so I'll just create this dimension style, make it 7-point, bold italic, and give it a background just for fun, just kind of a slight light gray background. All right, so now back to my classes. There's my dimension class. Let's edit that. There you go. And let's go ahead and associate this. So it's going to ask me if I want to apply this text style to everything that's already been created in the given class. I'll hit okie dokie. And hey presto, now all of my dimensions have their own beautiful custom text style associated with them. If you like your dimensions to have a different text style than everything else. Or maybe you have different dimension classes or sort of branch classes for architectural dimensions versus mechanical dimensions. I don't know. You could sort of do it that way. And then, of course, like any class, you can set a particular graphic attribute to your class, pen color, pen weight, all that stuff. So while we're looking at these document preferences, let's also look at associating dimensions. So I can auto associate or not. Let's go ahead and do that. And so if I do that, then as I dimension, if you look, you can see, I don't know how well you can see, zooming in doesn't really do much because it always stays the same size. So maybe zooming out would actually be useful. What happens if I got a black and white on there? Yeah, you can kind of see it there. You can see that there are these little green squares at these corners. Can everybody see that? Probably might be difficult to see on your screens. And so what that gives you a visual cue that this dimension is actually associated to the geometry. So associating the dimension to the geometry is really cool because it means that if I say move the geometry, nothing happens. What's going on here? We did associate it. That's odd. Oh, there we go. I don't know what was going on. So if I move the geometry, the dimension changes. If I edit the dimension, then the geometry changes. So they're linked, right? They're associated. You want to be careful because sometimes if you will delete the geometry, you might, or if you delete the geometry, you will for sure lose the dimension. Oh, I lied. Well, sometimes if you delete the geometry, you'll lose the dimension, and sometimes if you delete the dimension, you'll lose the geometry. So if you want to keep the dimension, but you no longer want to associate it, right? The trick there is to just do a cut command, Command X, and then just a paste in place, and then it comes back, and it's still there. It's in exactly the same spot, but it's no longer associated. So associating the geometry can be really useful. You can use it as an alternative to and sometimes you get these unsolvable constraints, and I should probably pick a simpler example. But you can, yeah, we'll try that one. There we go. So you can use that geometry to, or those dimensions to drive your geometry, for example. Yeah, whatever. But it can be tricky because you may end up moving things that you don't mean to. So I would say use that judiciously. Any questions about associating geometry? Okay. I'm not seeing any chats here, so that's great. All right, so similar to an associated geometry, if you look in your, should be in your dimensions and notes, yeah. So you've got constraints in Vectorworks. So wait, hold on. There is a chat question. Okay, great. So yeah, I can't see your shining faces because I'm watching my screen. So anyway, so similar, though a little different from dimensions per se, are your constraints in Vectorworks. So probably in your dims and notes palette, And there are a variety of different constraints. You can constrain angles, coincident, constraint distance, horizontal, and so forth. So I'll just focus on one of these. So let's try with a constrained horizontal distance. So I'm going to go ahead and snap from this corner to that insertion point. This control is not valid. Well, thanks. Why not? Oh, because it's a rotated plan. So let's constrain vertical distance. There we go. So you can see I've got this constrained vertical distance here. And so what that means is, by the way, this little green text, boy, that is really hard to read. I'm not sure there's anything I can do about it. Let me eliminate that constraint and try again. Maybe if I draw it differently. Yeah, it is. Come on. Okay. A little, nope, not any easier to read. All right. So this has been constrained. And so what that means is if I move the wall, nothing happens. Wow, this is great. That's really very interesting. All right, well, I've got some joined walls here, so probably I should pick a slightly simpler example. All right. There we go. So if I constrain these two vertically, come on. There we go. I was click dragging. That's my problem. So these are constrained as 511. If I move this horizontally, nothing happens because it's a horizontal, it's a vertical constraint. But if I move it vertically, then you can see the other geometry moves with it, right? So technically not a dimension, but it looks like a dimension. So I thought I'd throw that in there. Then, you know, a simple way to get rid of that is to just cut and paste in place, and then you've gotten rid of it. And so you can have horizontal or vertical dimension constraints. You can have concentric constraints, constrain the absolute distance. Right, so there we go. So now if I move this, they always stay same distance apart, which can have some, you know, interesting results. And like the little green squares from your associative dimensions, right? These little green squares that are at each of the dimension snap points, those don't print, neither do these associative or these constraints. It's kind of fun, you just kind of drag it along. So any of these sort of bright green things do not print.
Francois, another question.
Sure.
Can you add a constraint to a regular dimension afterwards?
Can I? I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Can you convert a regular dimension to a constrained dimension? Like looking at your earlier example that you were trying to do on the water closet, can you dimension that and then decide, oh, I really wish I had fixed that at 1'6", because then if I move the wall, the toilet will move with it. Can it be done
No.
after the fact?
No, you would just need to draw a new associative dimension.
Okay, not a big deal.
Yeah.
All right. Or think ahead.
Or plan
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so if I drive this, right, then that moves. If I drive this, then that moves. I lost my door in the process. So far, we've been dimensioning everything on the design layer itself, which actually I don't really recommend. Simply because these dimensions, because they're on the design layer, they're going to show up in every viewport that has the dimension class turned on. So they'll show up on my site plan. And so to avoid having them show up on the site plan, then I would need to have a dimension for my site plan and a separate dimension class for my floor plan and a separate dimension class for my roof plan. And, you know, it just gets to be this proliferation of dimension classes. So rather than do that, you know, what I tend to recommend is that you dimension in the annotation space, which, you know, we've already started doing that here, but I'm just going to get rid of all of those. Now, all that can be kind of tedious. And so there's a nice little command. It's not perfect, but it certainly gets you started. You'll find it under the it's under the AEC menu, Dimension Exterior Walls. But if you can't find it, you can just go to your Help menu and type Dimension. There it is. And so what it will do is it will go ahead and dimension any walls that sort of enclose, you know, form a closed path. So it'll distinguish interior versus exterior walls according to the path. If you have multiple layers populating the viewport, you need to specify which layer you want to dimension to. So if you want to dimension to 2 layers, you'll have to do the command twice, or, you know, kind of pick one and work from there. You can dimension relative to the wall or a core component. So this is one of the reasons why it's important when you're creating your wall styles to identify which component of the wall style is the structural core. And you can dimension to the outer sides and so on and so forth. You can give an overall offset from the building for, let's just pick 4'6", and then walls can be, say, 3 feet, and then doors and windows, I'll just do 24 inches. And I'll apply small dimensions to anything less than 1 inch, which I will tell it not to draw. In fact, let's just make that 1.5 inches. So don't draw any dimension that's less than 1.5 inches. And I'll hit OK. And boom, there you go. It's just in one fell swoop dimensioned all of my existing walls. Now, not perfect. But particularly where everything's all on one layer, or all the dimensions that you want are all on one layer, which may not be the case here. Kind of helpful. So then I can just, these are, by the way, these are, for the most part, chain dimensions whenever Vectorworks can manage that. And so I can just go in here and you know, clean these up. So here it's dimensioning to the center line of these windows. Here it's dimensioning to the wall. Here it's dimensioning. It's interpreting this as an exterior wall because these walls are existing, so they're on another layer. So, you know, I might have to delete that dimension or, you know, manually adjust it. And just kind of drag that point over to, say, here. And drag this point to here. So that's kind of a cool little command that can at least get you started on your dimensioning, and then you can clean it up from there. And then another useful command that don't necessarily use a lot of, but can be helpful, is convert an object to a dimension. So that's going to be under your modify convert, and convert object to a dimension. So I just drew that line and it just turned it into a dimension string. Or it'll convert an arc to an arc dimension. That can be actually quite useful. And so forth. So, you know, don't think it's going to work on a rectangle, but hey, we can always try. Nope, only works on lines and arcs. So those are two little secret commands that a lot of people don't know about that are useful. I want to jump onto the grid tool, but first I want to make sure to catch up and see that there aren't any questions. All right. So one or two versions ago, Vectorworks revamped the grid tool. And useful for buildings where you need to have a dimensioning grid. So the grid tool lives in your dims and notes palette. And there's a variety of grid things, polar, rectangular grid, grid bubbles, and so forth. But I'm talking specifically about the grid line, which is over here. And so, like many of the newer sort of annotation, detailing objects, sort of data bearing or data reporting objects, the grid line has a style. So there's the style for the grid line, and you can go ahead and change it, edit it, create your own custom one. We'll start with the one that's out of the box and we'll tinker with it later. And you can see that it asks me what my next grid label is, so it's 1. So I'm just going to start with 1. And I'll start here at the corner, and I'll click and hold, and I'll just drag my mouse down so that that grid line is vertical. And then I'll go to the next point. So click up or click drag and release, because I'm click dragging. And then I can take all of these and align them top and move them up 5 feet, whatever. And then if I want to grid in the other direction, I can do that too. Let's go back to my grid line tool. Only now I'm going to go into this next grid label, and I'm going to call it A. Right? And I'll click over here and I'll drag horizontally, and you see how it's given me an A. And then B automatically renumbers that B. And then there's C. And I don't know, let's throw a D down here. And at this last column, we'll do an E. And oh, I forgot this one. So I'll just go and put this back here. Great. So there we go. Those are all there. They're very awesome. And I'll do the same thing. I'll align them left. And maybe move them out 10 feet. I don't know. Just kind of guessing here. And of course, I can just edit all of these. I can just grab that point and drag it however I want it. Except I've got F out of order here. So here's F, C, D. I'm gonna come back and deal with that later. I feel like messing with it right now. And I don't know, this isn't really working for me stylistically. So let's go to the object info palette and highlight it and edit the style. And then down here, there's an edit bubble layout. And so I'm going to change that to Helvetica. Lowercase. We'll see if that sticks. Might not. Okay. Great. Ah, so beautiful. All right. So again, these have to be on the design layer. That you can't do these in annotations. It simply won't work. So now you'll see that I've got a floor plan, right? We were looking at this earlier. And here are my grid lines. They're showing up. This is a rotated floor plan, so they're also rotated. So they rotate with the drawing, obviously, because they're part of the design layer. But you'll notice that I've got some building elevations already set up. These are section viewports, right? Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. Okay. So object info, section elevation line, and let's just go ahead and navigate to that viewport. So there it is, and I'm going to update. There's my grid. Now it's a little tall. Or I could have just used the and then let's just move these down. Doesn't like that. That doesn't like that. All right, let's go do this. So there's my, if you can see this, there's my 1 through 6 grid. And over here, when I update this elevation, there's my Oh, what is wrong with? There we go. All right, that was easier than I thought. All right, there's my grid. Super happy. Oh, except these are out of order. See if this will work. So A, B is fine. F, C, D, and E, not so fine. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to select these that are out of sequence, and I'm going to right click on these and nope, got to do this in the, oh, yeah, that's not going to work. All right, let's go back to my floor plan. Cannot abide. All right, so I'm just going to select these, F, C, so forth. And if I right click on them in plan, there is this resequence command that pops up. As far as I can tell, that's the only way to get to this command is by right clicking on a series of selected grid lines. And you can see that it shows the order that they're in, the current value, and the result. And so I want what is currently D, right? Sorry, what I want is what's currently F to be at the top of the stack. So I'll just drag F up here to position number 1. So F becomes C, C becomes D, D becomes E, E becomes F, and hit OK. And it renumbers these. A, B, C, D, E, right, and so forth. And then if I go back to my building elevations, sorry, elevations 2-1, not 1-2, you can see that these have all been renumbered in elevation. They'll show up in my sections. Pretty sure. Yeah, there's one that shows up in the section. If I
don't want it to show up on certain drawings.
use a class,
Okay.
yep, use a class for that. I think that's the way to do it. And if, for example, your elevation is not, or your viewport is not perfectly orthogonal to the grid. So let's go to the annotations and let's just rotate this 1 degree. Barely rotate. Navigate to the viewport and update that. So I guess that's the other thing you could do, Don, is you could rotate your elevation by 0.001 degrees and have all your dimensions off by just a wee tad.
Is that a suggestion or a threat?
That's a I don't recommend it, but
Okay.
but if you want to try that as a workaround,
Okay.
let me know how it goes.
I think I'll use glasses.
Yeah, I think that's a better idea. So in other words, it knows when the grid is, because obviously if you had a skewed elevation, right, like an orthogonal grid would be completely confusing. But you can do radial grids and all sorts of cool things. So if you like to use grids for your projects, I recommend that you check out this tool. It's not one that we really have been using, but it's pretty nifty. And I always love something that will show up in multiple viewports. That's always fun. go back to 0 degrees. And navigate to the viewport and update. And they should come back. Yeah, I'll need to stretch them down again, but you get the idea. And then, you know, of course, you can dimension to them and so forth. So lowly dimensions, any other questions? Oh, there's somebody in the chat. Note how to modify the new drawing label. Sure. Yeah, so not really a dimension thing, but happy to look at that. So here's a custom drawing label that we came up with. Oftentimes we will issue drawings at 50% on 11 by 17s. So we'll actually format our drawings 22 by 34. So that's prior to the new drawing label. That was always something that we just had to add as like a symbol or just a floating piece of text or whatever. So like all the old, drawing labels, the new drawing label picks up the name and number of the viewport and displays it. So you can, you know, you can change the name of the viewport here. And obviously it'll change the name of the drawing label, or you can change the name of the drawing label and that'll change the name of the viewport either way. So just like the old one, it picks up the scale of the layer or the annotation space that it's in. And if I want to tinker with it, I can edit the style. And there's a couple of things I can do with the style. One is I can edit the drawing label layout. So I can change the, see, here's a constraint. There's a piece of text that's 30-point Helvetica, that's 24-point Helvetica, that's 8-point Helvetica, bold italic, and so forth. So so I can play with the line weights of all of these different components, text styles, and so forth. So and they're all sort of constrained. Yeah, we've already been there. So the other thing I can do when I edit the style is instead of editing the drawing layout, I can plug in, change the sequence settings. So scale factor, custom scale, these are all sort of adjustable. But the layout does not change. And then let's go to that. So scale factor, I don't think I can edit that. Oh yeah, I need to go back to layout. So if we look at this text block, right? In this case, I've got an option here on this text block. You see that it says use dynamic text. This is use dynamic text. This one, we don't have dynamic text. So whatever you write, that's just what's going to show up. So if you use that drawing label on a drawing that isn't 1/4-inch scale, you will be sad because it'll say, right? So I can go ahead and define that. So here, there's the field label. Let me play with that and exit that. All right. So if I draw, so here, the current field definition is drawing label and scale, right? And I've got some options, none of which is, 50%. So what I could do is at the end here, say on 24-inch by, I'm sorry, on 22 by 34-inch sheet, half scale on 11-inch. Let's see what that gives. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's so funny. So if I type my feet in inches, if I type inches for paper size, yes, it's a 1'10" by 2'10" sheet. That's hilarious. So let's go ahead and change that. So define my label. So I'll just say 22 by 34. Or whatever, And there we go. And if I say I want scale to be lowercase, because I'm really into lowercase, then I can just type scale. Boop. Boop. There we go. So now, right, if I change that from 1/4 to 3/16 and update, we'll say scale 3/16 equals an inch on 22 by 34, half scale on 11 by 17. Guy, does that work for you?
Francois, when you're dimensioning a plan, but you're building a model that has, sheathing and stucco or brick or stone or that,
Sure.
But you're wanting to dimension to the studs, are you just turning off the components on the, like a 1/4-inch plan in order?
Absolutely, absolutely. So a ground floor plan, these walls all have sheathing, stucco, baseboard. So all those components. Those are all there. Baseboard, drywall, stud, sheathing, stucco. Those are all there. And I'm just turning them off at that scale. And then often we'll show them at, say, 1/2 inch or 3/8 inch scale for details. For example, when you're dimensioning your millwork, you need to know that where the drywall is. You can't dimension to stud. That's not going to work out so well for you.
Right, because those plans will often then, like a cabinet, you'll have a space between the stud wall where the.
Yeah, in fact, you can see that right here, right?
Yeah.
I've got my little hand sink here is just floating a 1/2 inch off the wall.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
It doesn't look too bad. Then, of course, the other thing that you can do is in your wall style, let's edit the wall style. If I edit the component, I can make that a master snap point. So that gives that component, either the left or the right side of the component, some additional magnetism for my dimension strings, so that they will snap to that more readily than to anything else.
Can you choose both sides so that you have the ability to dimension to either side? Oh, okay.
Yep. Any other questions? All right, well, somehow we did it. We talked for over an hour about dimensions. Wasn't that fun? Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate it, and look forward to seeing everybody next month. Maybe it will be in person if the AIA will let us back in. Working through that still. And in the meantime, have a great month.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Pasquale.
Francois.
And
Thanks,
this will be
Francois.
recorded, so if anybody wants the link, I can send it to them for a little while anyway. All right, thanks, guys.
Sounds
Bye-bye.
good.
Bye.
Bye.